American military aviation began in 1909 when the U.S. Army Signal Corps purchased its first airplane, the Wright Military Flyer, which was designated Signal Corps Airplane No. 1. As the airplane evolved, figuring out who should oversee Army aviation started to get a bit controversial. There had been an early attempt at legislation to make the aviation service independent from the Signal Corps, but it died in committee. So the aviation section of the Army Signal Corps commanded Army aviation through the bulk of World War I. On May 24, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson established the Army Air Service through an executive order, which replaced the aviation section of the U.S. Signal Corps and acted as the nation's Air Force. The Air Service became a permanent branch of the Army in 1920 and became the Army Air Corps on July 2, 1926. In 1940, the Army Ground Forces, or AGF, struck an agreement with the Air Corps. The tasks of artillery spotting, local observation, emergency medical evacuation, liaison flying, and emergency wire laying were too fluid to be properly served by a separate branch of the Army. The ground forces needed to make requests to the Air Corps to handle local needs that were often carried out by slow, light aircraft. It simply made sense for the ground forces, the artillery in particular, to have limited organic aviation assets. An agreement was reached, and the AGF developed its own flight school at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. This effectively created a second air branch with the Army, and was the birth of today's Army aviation. Shortly after this, in 1941, the Army Air Corps was redesignated the Army Air Force. In 1947, just 2 years after the Second World War, the Army Air Force became an independent branch of the military, the United States Air Force. The very next year, the senior military and political leadership met in Key West, Florida, to hash out the responsibilities of each service. The Key West Agreement of 1948 allowed the Army to keep certain types of aircraft for certain very specific missions, but everything else went to the Air Force. One thing was made abundantly clear. If it was a combat fighting aircraft, it was to be Air Force. During the Korean War, it was obvious the Army's needs were evolving, and so did its aviation assets, including helicopters and improved light aircraft. The Army saw that the Air Force, although still dedicated to the close air support mission, had many other jobs to do, the biggest of which was nuclear deterrence. As a result, the close air support mission was not the Air Force's highest priority. Post-war budget cuts and the need for a strong nuclear deterrent had left the Air Force with a major uphill battle when the Korean conflict broke out. Massive demands were made for close air support, and the Air Force struggled, often in reactivated World War II equipment, to meet the demands of Army unit commanders. This left some Army generals with the idea that the Army's aerial mission could be better executed with small jets, and perhaps ones that could perform a limited tactical role. On June 21, 1954, the Office of the Chief of Army Field Forces, OCAF, requested that the Department of the Army procure 10 Cessna T-37 jet aircraft for testing in the Army Aerial Observation and Reconnaissance role. The Army formally requested procurement of the aircraft on the 23rd of November. In making the original request, General John Dahlquist admitted that the aircraft might accomplish a portion of the tactical reconnaissance for which the Air Force was responsible. Nonetheless, he called for an Army expansion in this area. General James Gavin, the Assistant Army Chief of Staff G3, doubted that the Air Force had complete primary responsibility for tactical air observation, but he could not officially agree with General Dahlquist's suggestion that the Army intrude into an area which was clearly the Air Force's responsibility. He pointed out, however, that the agreements with the Air Force in 1951 and 1952 had given the Army responsibility for conducting aerial observation to amplify and supplement other methods in locating, verifying, and evaluating targets, adjusting fire, terrain study, or obtaining information on enemy forces not obtained from the other services. General Gavin therefore felt the request for the T-37s could be justified in accomplishing these missions under the changed conditions of the modern battlefield. The Army staff interpreted the wording of the agreements to mean that observation, a short-range activity, was clearly the province of Army aviation. Reconnaissance, which was the undisputed mission of the Air Force, involved long-range, deep penetration of enemy airspace. To avoid Air Force contention of mission duplication, General Maxwell Taylor, soon after he succeeded General Matthew Ridgway as the Army Chief of Staff, directed that the word observation be used rather than reconnaissance when discussing the need of the Army for the T-37. Another term which caused problems was high-performance aircraft, which meant jet combat aircraft to the Air Force. The Army staff was directed to refer to the function of the T-37 as higher performance, which meant higher than the existing liaison aircraft. The Army did not make public its intention of procuring the T-37s until May of 1955, when General Ridgway announced to the Armed Forces Policy Council that a test quantity of 10 aircraft would be purchased from the manufacturer. General Nathan Twining, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, immediately objected to General Ridgway's definition of the mission of the T-37s. On June 14th, Harold Talbot, the Secretary of the Air Force, charged that the procurement of the aircraft was a distinct infringement upon the Air Force function, that the T-37 could not survive over enemy territory, and that it was both uneconomical and duplicative of Air Force missions. At this point, Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson ordered the Army to stop procurement of the T-37 and referred the entire matter to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In August, after lengthy deliberations, the Joint Chiefs directed the loan of T-37s to the Army from Air Force stocks to test their suitability as a light observation aircraft. To support the Army position before the Joint Chiefs, the Continental Army Command, CONARC, had revised its concept of the use of the T-37. At the same time, CONARC urged that once the procurement of the T-37 had been approved, it was vital that the troop tests for this aircraft be designed to determine and exploit its maximum capabilities. The Joint Chiefs of Staff did not specify the number of aircraft to be loaned by the Air Force, and the Army assumed that it would be the 10 aircraft that were originally requested. When the Army asked for the 10 aircraft for 2 years, the Air Force replied that an informal agreement by the Joint Chiefs of Staff had stipulated only 2 aircraft for 1 year. After lengthy negotiations with the Air Force, General Twining finally agreed to loan 3 T-37s for 1 year with an option to extend the loan for an additional year. General Taylor, rather than prolonging the argument and possibly endangering the test, reluctantly agreed to the Air Force terms. While the Department of the Army and the Air Force argued over the T-37, CONARC continued to plan for the troop test. On 12 July, CONARC requested that the aircraft be modified to include electronic and photographic equipment for test purposes. The Department of the Army concurred and in November requested the Air Force furnish delivery schedules, training of personnel, and modifications of the aircraft. In January of 1956, CONARC directed the Army Aviation School to prepare an outline test plan for 10 T-37 aircraft to determine organizational operational concepts for higher performance observation aircraft. CONARC forwarded the approved outline of the test plan to the Department of the Army on March 13th. For some reason, it was not until the end of May that the Department of the Army informed CONARC that the number of aircraft had been reduced from 10 to 3 and that the delivery date had slipped another 6 months or so. The department requested a revised plan based on the reduction of aircraft and the change in delivery dates. The Army Aviation School submitted the revised plan that June, and the test was designed to determine organizational and operational concepts for the employment of higher performance observation aircraft in supplement to the L-19 Bird Dogs, and was not to determine the suitability of the T-37 jet itself as a specific aircraft for these missions. On 14 December, the Department of the Army approved the plan, and CONARC asked the Army Aviation School to submit personnel requisitions for the test unit, a detailed budget estimate, detailed plans for Phase 2 of the test, and a proposed table of allowances, or TA, for the T-37 test unit, for what now had been named Project Longarm. The unit was activated by 3rd Army as the 7292nd Aviation Unit on the 5th of November 1957. Delivery of the 3 aircraft with the KA-20 cameras and DPN-31 radar beacons was changed from March of 1957 to July of 1957, necessitating a rescheduling of the test program yet again. Discussions were also held with the Air Force concerning the transition of pilots. In December, CONARC approved the proposed Air Force training program, but Cessna Aircraft conducted the transition training for the Air Force under contract. The test unit completed its unit training at Fort Rucker and then took part in tests covering employment with artillery and armor units at Fort Sill and Fort Knox during the first half of fiscal year 1958. In Phase 3 of the test program, the unit participated in Exercise Cumberland Hills at Fort Bragg from the 19th to the 30th of May, 1958. The test unit returned to Fort Rucker on the 4th of June. On 28 March 1958, the Department of the Army approved the extension of the T-37 test attachment through fiscal year 1959 and extended the loan of the T-37 aircraft until January of 1959. Long before the aircraft were returned to the Air Force, however, the Army had lost interest in Project Longarm. The Department of the Army was convinced that Air Force opposition had so influenced the thinking of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Department of Defense that it was not feasible to pursue the project. Additionally, the success and development of the A-01 Mohawk airplane had met most of the observation requirements being studied in the tests. The Department of the Army knew the test attachment would be equipped with the SLAR L-26 equipped aircraft and eventually the Mohawk, which was proving itself a capable platform. CONARC acknowledged the desirability of a medium observation aircraft organization, and the Army Aviation School was directed to integrate instructions for their employment into current programs of instruction. Although the Army Aviation School conducted the necessary tests using the T-37 test unit to form the basis of the new experimental unit, CONARC recommended disapproval of retention of the 3 T-37 aircraft by the Army Aviation School in view of limited value which would accrue from further testing. It suggested that the T-37 aircraft be returned to the Air Force on the 31st of December 1958. CONARC recommended that negotiations be entered into with the Department of the Navy to procure, on a loan basis, 3 North American T-28 Trojan propeller aircraft to support the new experimental test unit. The purpose of the troop test was to determine the organization, tactics, and techniques of employment of medium observation aircraft in support of the tactical operations of the Field Army. The test was not conducted as an evaluation of the merits of the T-37, but of the concept of operation of an aircraft which generally performed in a manner like the T-37. The Project Longarm tests completed this. Despite the completion of the T-37 tests, the Army still maintained an interest in the possible adoption of jet aircraft, and that leads us to the Army's second foray into jets. In April of 1961, the Office of the Chief of Research and Development directed CONARC to conduct a comparative flight evaluation of 3 types of jet airplanes. The Army Aviation Board was directed to conduct an evaluation between the Fiat G91, the Northrop N-156, which would later evolve into the F-5 Freedom Fighter, and the Douglas AD-4-2N. The testing was accomplished throughout the last quarter of fiscal year 1961. CONARC recommended on September 20th, 1961, that further evaluation be conducted prior to final selection of an Army close support airplane. The evaluation team was made up of board pilots of the Man-Machine project, augmented by some additional Army personnel, and 4 pilots on loan from the U.S. Marine Corps. In support of the airplanes was a host of engineering, maintenance, and flight test personnel provided by the respective manufacturers. Overall support of the entire project was provided on a generous scale by the Navy. Most of the evaluation was conducted at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, but the sod field operation took place at Site 8 Alpha Sod Stage Field, a satellite of Naval Auxiliary Air Station Softly in Pensacola, Florida. This operation made aviation history in one respect, for while the Fiat G91 had been flown from sod fields in Europe since its issue to NATO forces, and was in fact designed for such operations, This was the first venture away from paved runways for the U.S. equipment and personnel involved. It is also believed to have been the first sod field operation in this country with jet fighters of any type. In the event of an emergency requiring an immediate selection, the A-4D Skyhawk aircraft was probably the most suitable of the types tested. Something that Northrop did that was of note was they put this one-off two-wheel bogie on the nose gear. Now, I'm not sure if this was for strictly a demonstration on the ramp or if they actually flew it this way, but the landing gear could not be retracted. You'll notice that during all of the side field test program, the N-156 is in Air Force markings. But at some point, at least one of the aircraft was taken out at Edwards Air Force Base and put in Army markings, probably just as a promotional item. To prepare for the side field testing of the N-156, it was given what some people called a mud flap, which is a debris deflector on the nose gear, and was equipped with lower pressure tires. The aircraft actually performed quite well, and the Army was very enthusiastic about it. Either 2 or 3 of the German-Italian-built Dornier Fiat G91s designed for operations from unimproved airfields into the front lines were also entered into the competition. The test included evaluating the 12.7mm and 30mm arm variants. I can only find records of the 2 single-seaters being used in the tests, but there are some pictures that show a 2-seat training version being present, although I do not believe it was used in the tests. The 2 A4D 2N Skyhawks, bureaus number 148490 and 148483, were borrowed by the U.S. Army and modified by Douglas for evaluation in the competition. Modifications of the Army Skyhawks included large dual wheels on beefed-up main landing gear mounts, a heavier wing to house the larger landing gear. This front view shows the modified wheel wells and the dual main wheels installed on the A4D Skyhawk to assist in sod field operations. The A4D also had this special installation of a drag chute. Flown by Douglas test pilot Drew Wood, the modified Army Skyhawk won the competition in what was sometimes called the two-wheeled dirt buggy. Sadly, the tests were marred by tragedy when on the 27th of July 1961, Italian test pilot Captain Riccardo Bignamini was killed when the Fiat G91R1, designated as Army 0052, stalled abruptly during a JATO-assisted short-field takeoff when one of the rockets failed to fire. This effectively ended Fiat's involvement in the test. The project was canceled when Army funds were diverted to helicopter procurement, but that did not end the Army's interest in obtaining a tactical jet, nor the Air Force's efforts to stop them. The new Air Force Chief of Staff, General Curtis LeMay, made it clear that he thought the Air Force should control everything that flew, from B-52s to puddle jumpers and helicopters. The Army was equally adamant to keep trying to obtain dedicated assets for its mission. This was made clear when the Army had 2 pilots join the tripartite squadron that was evaluating the Hawker-Siddeley XV-6A Kestrel, the jet that would eventually evolve into the Harrier jump jet. The Air Force was not happy about the Army's encroachment into their mission, which led to the 1966 Johnson-McConnell Agreement. The Army agreed to give up all fixed-wing combat aircraft with a few carve-outs, such as the OV-1 Mohawk, in return for a free hand with helicopters. The Army even had to give the Air Force its CV-2 Caribous and the de Havilland Buffaloes it had on order. This agreement was not well received by either service, as the Air Force did not want the Caribous, and many Army officers saw it as giving away a valuable asset for little more than a few promises. Promises that were not really kept, as the Army wound up having to fight the Air Force again over the advanced Cheyenne attack helicopter. But that's another story. And there you have it, the story of the Army's pursuit of tactical jets. The Army has used some older combat jets in test functions, such as 2 F-10 Sky Warriors that were used by a military electronics contractor. They painted Army on the side of the aircraft because it was an Army contract, but the planes were only ever flown by civilian test pilots. The Army and Air Force still essentially operate under the 1966 Johnson-McConnell Agreement today, with the only jets the Army flies being VIP transports. But with drone technology changing the battle space so quickly these days, There are new frontiers that have yet to be fully fleshed out. I want to give special thanks to Tony Chong for letting me use the photographs from his webpage, which I will link below, which shows a lot of great pictures from the N-156F competition with the Army contract.